Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So a lot of athletes can get pretty good at fitness without having gone through all the quote unquote proper steps of development to get there. So, folks can come in with some sort of athletic background where they have pretty good capacity, maybe some strength, and they just start doing CrossFit. And all of a sudden, they're able to get themselves on top of the bar for a bar muscle up. They can lift decent weight. They can go kind of fast during conditioning workouts, maybe get a little bit tired, but they can push through. And again, they're able to develop reasonable capacity kind of across the board, but they haven't necessarily gone through all of the steps that one would hope that they would go through to get to that level of development. And this is something that can be a little bit tricky because people can get pretty good, and then they don't necessarily want to take steps backward to sort of clean up the various things that they've skipped along the way. So what becomes an issue is when athletes start to hit glass ceilings in their development, right? That they're unable to potentially get stronger, that they start to fall apart during conditioning workouts and trying to go back and build up enough capacity for them to get through stuff without totally fatiguing, or we have weird chicken winging on muscle ups and an athlete never really learned to do the technique properly or develop the appropriate shoulder range of motion. And that these glass ceilings can be pretty frustrating because an athlete has gotten pretty good without ever having really learned all the pieces along the way. So Luke, we think about skipping steps in development, some of the issues that can cause. I know you recently had some conversations about this. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I had a conversation with one of my athletes, and we were obviously discussing, what the training direction is going to look like post-open. And this athlete is fairly experienced. He's an experienced coach as well, so he sort of has an understanding of sort of deeper inner workings of training and physiology. And he just finished his sort of OPEC CCP. And obviously we're just sort of discussing, some of the points on structural balance and the needs of that in an athlete. And an athlete like him, where he's gone through a lot of good quality training, and he's accumulated a lot of volume doing his sport. And he's done, various different routes of training, followed blogs, done strength cycles, added on metcons. He did all the usual stuff. And what we're really trying to do now is just take a couple of steps back. Obviously, he's the furthest away he's going to be from competition for this year, and we are looking at trying to identify, some structural balance issues, but then also some technical issues within his training. And what I was trying to explain to him was that he's obviously his performance is at a certain level, and what we're trying to do is just amplify his current abilities and make them really solid. So, what he will sort of find is that he might be a little bit erratic in the not erratic, more sporadic in his performance. And what we're trying to do is use training that's going to be a little bit more, you could probably say, of a beginner's trainer in nature, to try to really amplify what he has and make it a little bit more consistent. He's fairly good. He's a fairly natural athlete. He's played many different sports growing up, and he took the sport up and he started CrossFit, and he got pretty good quite quickly. But then sort of the increases that he's had to make over the past couple of years haven't been where he wanted them to be. And going through this approach is hopefully going to help him out and, build a little bit more of a platform for him to then progress his training on. And I think that it's interesting because there's obviously a lot of different things that we're trying to teach these types of athletes in this situation. There's lots of things that we're trying to create, but then as well as that, there's a huge psychological component, and trying to get buy-in to someone is really important. And then what I actually find as well is that sometimes athletes don't actually develop good training habits, so they sort of just dive into it and they're doing a lot of specific work, and they're actually making those improvements. And you see this quite often when people just try to replicate the training of the elite, and they don't have that training base, and they don't really have that ability to auto-regulate, the ability to understand when they need to ease off of something, They look at training sessions day to day, and it's literally about that session, the results that day. And it's just trying to sort of create buy-in with those athletes is quite difficult. And generally, obviously, you have all these physiological and skill acquisition changes that you're trying to create as well on top of that. So it makes it quite a complex task. But if you are able to get that buy-in and people are able to apply themselves, then usually they're going to be able to make a little bit more improvement and create a bit more of a platform and a foundation to make improvements in the future off of.
So Luke, what were you seeing with this athlete that sort of made you think, okay, maybe we need to backtrack a little bit? And what was the conversation like about potentially taking those steps backwards?
It wasn't really, the conversation was more of me just telling him what's going to happen in training, and then sort of explain it to him with a little bit more of he's a coach himself, so I was able to explain and dive a little bit deeper into it. But what I was noticing was that in terms of his performance, he was sort of, throughout the Open, he was sending me videos, he was making all the right moves, he was pacing things pretty well, but then there was just certain things that he wasn't able to sort of push at certain stages. And what I actually just found is that on some of the workouts, he may have like hit a wall. And, part of that is just actually, we were only training for a little bit of time before the Open. And we've spoken about functional volume in the past, but he might have just had to, he just didn't necessarily have it there. But yeah, it was just sort of, he was making all the right moves from like a, sort of like in the workouts. He wasn't really making any rash decisions. He looked like an experienced athlete, but he looked like an experienced athlete that just had some form of limitation in capacity. Where that was strength on some of them, and it was also just general work capacity on the others. So what you usually find is sort of that they might have skills there, they might have ticked those boxes off. When you do come across an athlete that needs to work on this, you might see that they pace generally pretty well, but then what ends up happening is they have some limitation in terms of their physical capacity, and it's about, okay, how can we really dive into this and try to make sure that we don't have that limitation in the future, and what do we need to do, and how do we, what steps need to be taken backwards to eventually go forwards.
So what do you guys think about different types of compensation that you see? I mean, you touched on a few of those, but what's something that you typically see where it's like, oh man, this athlete is compensating? And that could be very specific movement wise, or sort of like big picture overall performance.
I tend to see a lot of it in kind of weightlifting stuff, where people, maybe their strength is getting them through. And you'll see like open workout this year with the heavier clean and jerks. They're potentially not technically that great with their lifts, but they're able to maybe get through that second to last bar, get into the final bar, just based on raw strength without as much technique as they should be using to do that kind of thing. And I think that's especially common in people coming in who are experienced athletes, just not in CrossFit. So maybe they played high school sports and they learn how to power clean in their school weight room, and they have a decent amount of raw strength, but no one's ever actually taught them how to lift properly. That's usually the biggest one that I see for athletes coming in with experience.
Yeah. I think that there's a few layers to that as well, as far as people both having, learn to do something improperly. The power clean is a great example where a lot of people potentially did some sort of hang power clean in a high school weight room that's pretty ugly, landing with their feet super wide and barely able to get into a front rack position and kind of leaning back to catch the bar. And they've actually developed the ability to move a decent amount of weight with that. And for them, it's not just like, okay, let's teach you how to do this correctly and you're going to lift more weight. That in a lot of cases, they're not going to lift more weight. And, even if they learn and practice, et cetera, it's going to take them a very long time to actually be able to do more easier and better with quote unquote proper technique, because they've grease the groove, so to speak, so many times on this quote unquote improper movement pattern that just being like, oh, great. Yeah, we're going to get you a good front rack. We're going to get your hips back and it's going to be awesome. You're going to all of a sudden be super strong. It's like, maybe not. And that, these athletes are potentially making a sort of wise decision for their performance as far as just like continuing with their sort of sketchy movement patterns, especially if they have significant movement restrictions that they're compensating around, right? So if they have some sort of hip impingement issue or poor motor control of the hips and the low back or inability to stabilize the rib cage properly, that being in a quote unquote good position for them is actually not a good position because it hurts their hips, it hurts their back, their spine is unstable, and their sort of subconscious motor control system is like, yo, we're not doing this. We're going to do it this way instead because this is actually safer.
Yeah.
And I think on that point, it also comes into efficiency. So it's, we're improving them and they might be moving less weight, but they're moving more safely. They might just be moving more efficiently and, utilizing that in a Metcon, even if they have less actual strength doing it that way, they may be able to get further through a workout because they're fatiguing themselves less. They're leaving a little more in the tank by moving better.
Yeah, I see compensation quite a bit with people who generally have, you could just say sort of like people call it mentally tough. I just say they're probably just a little bit less sensitive to sort of like the physical intensity of training, but you tend to see it when they sort of put themselves into a hole the first third of a workout and then they just gut through the rest of it and they're able to maintain some level of movement and they tend to be able to compensate through that. And I know, Todd, you've spoken before about people compensating through energy systems where they actually start to develop a certain efficiency with this, with essentially not being able to pace or work out and with being able to operate once they've sort of hit threshold and be able to sustain some level of power and continuation in their movement once they've sort of hit threshold. So I think that's quite difficult, is just actually getting people to do stuff that just is easier and just say you literally need to go easier than you think you need to go. And it's we've spoken about it before as well, where you might be prescribing actual certain specific paces for people to be doing in workouts just so that they don't hit that threshold and they just get out of the habit of doing it, and you essentially just force them to train in a certain environment to create certain adaptations.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the idea of sort of like compensating through energy systems is really interesting and really important for a lot of people who, like we've talked about, have just sort of jumped in and gotten okay at doing CrossFit. And what a lot of those folks end up doing is that they're able, just through, their sort of like athleticism and Luke, like you mentioned, potentially, psychological toughness or just lack of sensitivity to certain types of discomfort and just like a force of will to push through, where they can kind of like go into stuff without really having a good understanding of pacing, start to blow up on something and just kind of like keep grinding it out. And, I think that Jason Khalipa circa 2009 is probably a pretty good example of this type of athlete, where if you watch him working out, he's just like constantly falling apart, but just never actually really stops. And you're like, holy cow, like this guy is just dying, but he's still just going. All right, good for him. And that, we don't want to necessarily use that as an example because Khalipa probably had some other stuff going on that facilitated him being able to still perform at a high level like that. But for a lot of these people, what they're doing is they're sort of like digging too deep on each set of movement, sort of like, and without getting too far into it, some of the stuff that Evan Picon has talked about that we've referenced previously, and actually I'm going to repost the interview that I did with him on the Legion feed potentially before or after this comes out. So that will potentially be something that if you want to dig into that more, you can find that interview and really go into the weeds with it. But that these people are essentially creating these occlusions and desaturating their muscle of oxygen, which sort of like they're just like getting a bodybuilding pump doing doing CrossFit and then sort of like falling apart. And then some of them are able to kind of fall apart and then quickly recover and do it again, and then fall apart and recover and do it again, sort of like Kalipa, just based upon the, the sort of like strength and muscle endurance that they've developed and just like massive mitochondrial density in those specific muscle groups. But that it's not really a great strategy for long-term development, that these people are going to hit some sort of glass ceiling in their ability to keep progressing because they're sort of like getting good scores on CrossFit workouts, but they're kind of doing it wrong, so to speak. And that what really needs to happen is that these people need to be able to match the supply and demand of oxygen in the muscle and blood flow, rather than just sort of like utilizing all the oxygen immediately, creating a pump, falling apart, recovering, and doing it again. And that the way to do that is not to just like do more hard CrossFit stuff. The way to do that, like you mentioned, Luke, is to potentially back off and come up with a lot of different pacing scenarios that enables them to get a lot of work done without actually creating those occlusions, and to sort of progress that from, more basic scenarios, potentially in cyclical work, to more difficult mixed scenarios where they do have to do a lot of dynamic contractions without actually occluding. And that's like a potentially many year process to sort of like take someone back and try to rebuild that. And honestly, some people's physiology probably just isn't going to allow them to do that. But it is one of those things where it's like, cool, you can do this compensating. And if you want to potentially fix that, you have to go way back, slow way down, do a lot less crazy CrossFit shit, and sort of relearn how to actually pump blood around your body and utilize oxygen in the muscle.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of quite a big challenge with it, is the fact that the sort of responsible thing to do, and if someone is really obviously engaged in someone's development, it's like, okay, we're just going to take some steps back. We're going to go through this. It might take a while, but it's going to be better for you in the long run. It might not necessarily happen exactly how we want it to, and I want you to buy into this process. And it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, especially as people constantly see just people throwing on more intensity, more CrossFit, and just more sport-specific type work in order to get better at it. And I mean, it's sort of, it's a challenge, especially if you are trying to be a little bit more thought out in someone's program or in your own training, especially when you see just a lot of different crazy stuff going on and people actually being able to adapt to it and actually being able to perform well off of it. I think it's something that a lot of I've had to personally do it myself, and I think that it's probably something that most people after a couple of years into CrossFit get to some stage and to some level of this, especially if they've gone through if they've sort of just jumped straight into some sort of more sports specific training straight away, and then just doing a lot of strength work and then just a lot of hard metcons.
What about with training habits? I mean, that's a slightly different framing, I guess. But I mean, we're talking about people taking a step back and improving their movement patterns, improving their sort of like energy system utilization. But I mean, another big piece is just understanding how to train as a whole, and not just kind of coming in every day and kicking your own ass and, crawling out of the gym, but that there's an understanding to the bigger picture goals of training that some people may need to learn. What do you guys see there?
I mean, I think that developing training habits is probably one of the first things that needs to be done, and I don't think that the majority of sort of traditional entry points into CrossFit actually I don't necessarily think that they create that. A lot of people do focus on the outcome of the session. There's a big emphasis on the leaderboard. You see some funky stuff with people basically performing their front squat, back squat, and overhead squat in different stances just to get weight on the bar and hit the reps for the day. And that if that feeds into someone's training when they are looking into this as a competitive sport, that can be a bit of a sticky point, because there's so much to do in this as a sport, and you want to consolidate the amount of things that you practice, and you want to understand that training is a process, and that when you are hitting a training session, it's about where is this session going to be in 6 weeks' time towards the end of the block, and potentially what's the test going to be on this training piece. And it's not necessarily about hitting those 5 sets at 85% with rest in as hard as you can, because essentially that's going to develop into something that's going to be a little bit more quote unquote CrossFit and something that's going to look more like competition. It's just trying to get people to understand that and maybe just take themselves out and have a look at that sort of 30,000 foot view of their training and their development from the beginning.
And that's hard to get buy-in with. So how do you do that?
Well, I try to draw links and parallels to traditional sport, or like just other sports that have been around for a lot longer. And I try to sort of get people to understand, especially if someone has been an athlete previously in a different sport. I try to break it down, use some parallels that they might have come across. I work with a couple of rugby players, and typical example is like, okay, cool. You remember all of those drills that you went through, as a kid, all of those ball handling skills, all of the different running drills and stuff like that. Like, some of those situations and those environments did not look like you playing the sport. Or, for instance, one of the things that we would do is as kids, we would play a lot of sort of like larger field environments to really exaggerate certain elements of the game, and then bring it in to something that's more specific. And all of a sudden, we were able to have those certain areas elevated in terms of performance. So I try to draw those parallels. If someone doesn't necessarily have that sporting background, I try to break it down into something that's probably a little bit more of a similar process to them, like learning a language or learning like an everyday skill, or the process that they might go through professionally or something like that. Is just something that's probably a little bit less driven by just emotion and just get them to try and have a look at things a little bit more objectively.
John, what about you?
I think it takes a certain type of mentality for an athlete to be able to do that. For an athlete to be able to be comfortable with looking at what they've done previously and acknowledging that it might not be right. And I've found that there are some people that just can't do that. Not to be too negative on it, but there are people who they don't have that capacity or desire to make the sacrifice and take the hit to the ego and kind of realize that they've been wrong in the past in terms of whether it's movement or approach to workouts or whatever it is. And sometimes you can't change someone's viewpoint on that, or you can't change their mental approach to an exercise or a movement enough that you're going to make the change needed. And I think sometimes you have to be okay with the fact that not everyone is going to be perfect with it.
We talked about this before, where a lot of athletes are just thinking about everything they do as an evaluation, that they're either passing or failing, that they also potentially think that by not pushing themselves to their maximum potential in terms of the weight lifted or the pace that they attempt to hold on something, that they are, not trying hard enough and not living up to their maximum potential. And so undoing a lot of that constant evaluation and self-evaluation that athletes are going through, as well as just that misunderstanding that, if you're not putting the most weight on the bar that you possibly can to do tall snatches, that you're somehow like screwing up and leaving adaptation on the table. I mean, this is a real thing, right? This is something that happens all the time.
Tall snatches with 95%.
Yeah, I mean, it's a totally real thing, and this happens in our group classes at South Loop Strength and Conditioning, where people just that it's almost like, okay, you're looking at the exercise that you're doing similar to choosing like a class track in high school, where it's like, if you're not in all honors classes, like you are a quitter and a loser and you're absolutely failing, and you're not going to get into a good school, and you're not going to get a good career, and you're going to die poor, and your parents are going to be ashamed of you. And it's like, if I don't load as much weight as possible on my tall snatches right now, like I am just not cutting it. It's like, what in the world is going on here?
I think that also comes down to the competitive nature of CrossFit. Like, everything we do is measured, and from a competitive standpoint, the numbers, the data, like it's all out there for people to look at. And I think that doesn't help people. Because they can constantly kind of check themselves and see, oh well, I'm working at 60%. That's terrible. I need to be doing this. I should be able to do this. I did this much weight for this variation of the lift, et cetera, et cetera. And the constant update of data from a personal and a global level, for some people is just too much to be able to take that step back.
Yeah. I think one of the things I find is that, if people find things that they're not good at, it's that there is almost this tendency to be like, oh shit, like people obviously evaluate their sort of self-worth on something like that, but then it's trying to get them to think this is a good thing. This is actually like, we found something that we need to develop, and this is going to bring you up overall. And it's about making you as well balanced as possible, and then trying to amplify everything. So the fact that we found something that you struggle with is actually a good thing. And I think that, a lot of people, the sort of cliche of, there is a bit of a, smash your weaknesses and do all of this type of stuff. I was like, there's an element of good within that. And I do think that is something that is a benefit to CrossFit. I think that, there is this sort of idea of, okay, you need to bring up the areas that you're weak in to create more well-roundedness. But then as well as that, people that can then just take that sort of, that not necessarily the best mindset with their training and overdo it. And then they sort of like lose actual focus of doing things objectively, and they just go through it mindlessly, and they think, just do it every day. And it's like, yeah, but then that develops a whole host of other problems, there's like, do handstand push-ups every single day. It's like, okay, well, now you have a neck issue, so what you can do now? It's like, so yeah, obviously there's two sides to that.
Yeah, totally. It's like the pendulum has swung too far for most people in the CrossFit space, right? That a lot of people just in the world need to work harder and push themselves more and focus on their weaknesses and track their data and have structure to what's going on. And a lot of people in this sort of like, I want to get really good at this specific sport, are so far on the other end of the spectrum that understanding that they've developed, like we're talking about, just a bunch of compensations in terms of their movement patterning, their energy system utilization, the way that they approach training, and that the best way to actually remove those compensations and to get rid of those glass ceilings on their performance is to actually just like take a bunch of steps back and improve their fundamentals and potentially stop pushing themselves so hard all the time. That can be a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.